All very welcome to this spectacular program. This is the largest program we've had at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in several decades. So thank you so much for participating. It's been since Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. That'll give you a little bit of a flavor for how long it's been. And we are not competing with the Blackhawks. We arranged that too. Tonight's discussion's on the record, and you're welcome to tweet. If you could just make sure your phones are on silent. We'll be tweeting it, and you'll see some Twitter handles up there. Our own Dick Longworth will be doing a write-up, so if you want to send it out to anybody, there'll be 800 words on the website tomorrow. That'll be a concise summary of what we talked about tonight. We have loads of members and sponsor groups that we went out to tonight. Thank you so much to our partners, if I could list them. The Auditorium Theater, our beautiful venue, the CFA Society of Chicago, the CEO Roundtable, the Dartmouth Club, the Harris School, the Harvard Club, the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, the Paulson Institute, the Wharton Alumni Club, World Business Chicago, and the YPO Chicago Windy City Chapter. So thank you very much to all of our partners for your help and outreach. Many of you know the Chicago Council runs about 150 events a year. They're not all like this, but we have them of all sizes. Membership starts at $80 per year, and we'll have a table outside if you'd like to join. I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming programs. Tomorrow night we'll welcome Dan Dresner. He'll be also talking about the financial crisis. We have lots of discussions on China. We'll have Jim Steinberg here on June 17th, and then our CME lecture this year, our fourth one, will welcome Nobel laureate Myron Scholes on the 19th of June. For our young professional members of the audience, afterwards when you have your meetup, please go to aisle 1 and make sure you have your pink wristband on, and you will be admitted backstage. I'm going to get off stage now, and if you could please join me in welcoming to the stage the Chicago Council Vice Chairman and former Chicago Federal Reserve Bank President Michael Moskow, who will be introducing our speakers tonight. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this program, this very unique program. We're honored to have Secretary Timothy Geithner with us tonight for his only Chicago appearance. And joining him in conversation, we're very fortunate to have his Treasury predecessor, Secretary Henry Paulson. So tonight's discussion will take us behind the scenes of the world's worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. At a time when the country needed bold and swift action, these two individuals played significant roles in one of the most complex crises in recent memory. As you know, it's quite unusual to have two former Treasury secretaries on any program at the same time. So we're in for a real treat tonight. I look forward to the discussion and later posing some of your own questions for their consideration. So to formally introduce our speakers, Tim Geithner served as the 75th Treasury Secretary from 2009 to 2013 under President Barack Obama. Between 2003 and 2009, he served as President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And that's when we worked together when I was at the Chicago Fed for 4 of those 6 years. He's currently President of Warburg Pincus. Hank Paulson served as the 74th Treasury Secretary from 2006 to 2009 under President George W. Bush. And prior to his service at Treasury, Hank had a 32-year career at Goldman Sachs, serving as chairman and CEO since the firm's initial public offering in 1999. He's currently the chairman of the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago. So Tim, here's the plug. Signed copies of Secretary Geithner's book, Stress Test, Reflections on Financial Crises, are available for purchase in the lobby. And I have read the book. I've read his book and Hank's book, both books. So please join me in welcoming to the Chicago Council Tim Geithner and Hank Paulson.
Well, Tim, welcome to Chicago. This is quite a crowd, and it's quite a testament to you and the great service you gave your country. And it's my honor to interview you because there's few people in the world I have a higher regard for than you. So
it does bring back some bad memories to be here with you.
Yeah.
I mean, it was my great privilege too to work with you. You know, just a great thing, great experience to have together. But it does bring back some bad memories.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And speaking about bad memories, now it's been well over a year since you've left Washington, D.C., stepped down as Treasury Secretary. Are there days when you miss the excitement, the action? Is there any morning when you get up and you wish you were Treasury Secretary again?
No.
No.
I mean, I loved my work. It was the only thing I'd ever done, and I thought it was like just an enormously great, rewarding privilege. Even at the worst moments of terror and panic, it was so compelling, and I work with such great people, of course, including Hank and Ben Bernanke. But no, I don't miss it, and I don't miss the politics of that place. And it's nice to be with my family again.
Yeah. That way we agree on that. You know that. So you're an author now, and if you haven't written, if no one is here is, if you haven't really written a book or tried to write a book, it's hard to appreciate how really demanding and difficult that is. So, what was it like? Did you enjoy writing it? What did you like? What didn't you like about writing a book?
Well, it was much better than I thought, but I had very low expectations, and I really thought I would never do it. But it was a good experience. You know, I wanted to try and give people the chance to try to look at what we faced and the choices we made through our eyes, because those decisions, of course, even today, are so wrapped in mystery, I think, and complexity and myth and misperception, and still look so inexplicable, really, to so many people. And I thought that it was important, and you did this wonderfully in your book, which is to try to give people a sense of what our choices were, because they were mostly bad choices, terrible choices. So they had a better feel for why we came down where we did in those moments. And it was a good experience to go back over those decisions, even with all the PTSD and everything, and to sit with our colleagues, our co-combatants, and sort of go over it again, to crawl over it carefully again, and to ask ourselves those hard questions.
You know, it's interesting because this is an absolutely terrific book, but I would say I looked at it and I read it and I saw 4 books, because one of the books was what you just described, Going Through the Crisis. There is a part of this book that I would almost insist anyone that came to me for career advice and a young person read, because there's a part about, as you describe your career and managing your career, that's really fascinating. There's a part that could be a textbook for anyone on how to manage a crisis, and then there's a part about sort of the collision with the politics and the financial crisis. You know, we will come back later to the career thing, but I want to get to where you started when I said, do you wish you were back in Washington? So let's start with 2008, and you write in the book that anyone who was not afraid during the financial crisis did not know how close we were to the abyss. And of course, you and I got a chance to work with some of those people, and some of the people I saw in Congress. But that's not the question. The question is fear. How did you deal with it during the crisis? How did you handle the fear?
Well, Paul, just give
He's lost his voice for a moment. The fear is overwhelming. Yeah.
How's this? Better?
Yeah, good.
I don't know. Mostly, Hank, I tried to focus on what our choices were and spent a huge amount of time on the phone with you and Ben and our colleagues just trying to work through them. And I found that as long as you just kept focused on what we could do and didn't get lost in a set of, caught in the panic or paralyzed by the bad choices or caught in the sort of endless swirl of just debating the problem or debating whether it would be bad, maybe it would get better. You just focused on the relentless challenge of trying to say, okay, but what could we do? And what next? And what next? I found that was sort of calming and reassuring, and I found no better way of dealing with it than trying to deal with it through acting.
Yep. And when you were home at night, was the family a help, or did you just try to sleep, or what?
Well, I think like you, I had this tremendously amazing gift in a wonderfully supportive wife. My kids at that point were in high school, at least until I went to Treasury, and my daughter was in college then. And we tried to protect them from as much as possible, not get them caught up in it, preserve a little distance from the public aspect of it. But that was a great escape for me, a great comfort to be able to spend those rare moments with them. I tried to read a lot. Not about economics or about finance, but read about other things. That was calming too. But mostly I just tried to stay focused on what our choices were, because we had to act.
Yep. And as you look back now, so let's focus on the first part of the crisis. 2008, 2007, 2008. What do you, as you look now, what do you think was the most impactful things that the government did, the most important things we did?
You mean the bad ones or the good ones?
The good ones. We could talk about good and bad,
Well, I think the most important things happened in two stages. The first was on Columbus Day weekend, when you and Ben Bernanke and Sheila Bair and I put together this pretty unorthodox, unprecedented mix of the forceful injections of capital into the financial system combined with a set of guarantees. Of course, that followed a really a desperate but remarkably creative period of innovation by your colleagues at Treasury and at the Fed in trying to prevent the collapse of the money market and the commercial paper markets, those other set of funding mechanisms. But the decisive moment in that first stage of the crisis was on Columbus Day, when that mix of swap lines by the Fed, guarantees by the FDIC, capital from the Treasury, really did break the back of the panic. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't sufficient. We all knew that at the time. Yep. But it was the necessary thing then, and it was very effective. And then, of course, the economy was still, falling off the cliff and deteriorating at a really pretty alarming rate. And in the early '09, when the president took office, we confronted this still pretty scary set of challenges, because even with all those guarantees, with that capital, with the extraordinary actions the government had taken, we still had a system that was paralyzed. And as I said, the economy collapsing. And so at that second stage, the most important things we did were this very forceful package of fiscal measures, tax cuts, and public investments, larger in relative terms than what Roosevelt did in the Great Depression, combined with a new wave of monetary policy creativity by the Fed, and then ultimately with the recapitalization strategy that is the title of this book called The Stress Test. And that strategy helped make it possible to put a floor under the economy, reduce the risk of a Great Depression, and to recapitalize the system remarkably quickly, largely with private money, so that the investments that you made were repaid really very quickly. We forced additional capital in on top of that, and of course ultimately delivered for the taxpayer, or for the average American, the pretty extraordinary, unforeseeable thing, I think, which is a positive return on the trillions of dollars that were put into the system to prevent collapse, or protect the average American from collapse. But I would say in those two stages, it was those two pieces of innovation.
Yep. So let's talk for a minute about Lehman Brothers. Why do you think it is that, despite the fact that you, Ben, and I have all said repeatedly we couldn't find the authorities that to prevent the failure? There are some authorities we had, but we don't think those would have prevented the failure. Why do you think it is, despite the fact that we've all said that so many people doubt us?
Because people find it inexplicable that a country like the United States could go into a crisis like this without the most basic set of emergency powers you need to protect people from the consequence of financial panics. You know, they still think of our government, or our president, or our central bank as all-powerful in many ways. So I think they find it inexplicable. But finance is it's not like national security. We don't give the president standing discretion authority to protect people from financial crises, because the fear is that if you do that, you create a set of conditions, incentives, moral hazard that makes future crises more likely. So we went into this crisis with a very weak, tragically inadequate set of tools, and the Fed at that point had sort of run through everything, and without a willing buyer for Lehman, we had no legal authority to prevent them from collapsing. I tell the story in the book about how when I went to the New York Fed in October of 2003, when they decided they could trust me, they showed me this thing they called the Doomsday Book, which was a binder of options in a crisis. I thought that'd be pretty cool. So I looked at that book, and it was terrifying, because it was a lot of pages, but the tools were, I mean, it was clear that even then, the tools were going to be weak relative to a classic run. And we went through those 3 inches of options pretty much by January of '08, you know, when the crisis was still in its infancy.
Yeah, well, I remember the Bear Stearns weekend where people had told me we didn't have these authorities to deal with a failing non-bank. I didn't believe it until the time came. So let's.
I mean, in some ways that makes it worse for people, because people saw us invent a bunch of things with no precedent. Paul Volcker wrote about what we did is we acted at the edge of our legal authority, not beyond the edge, but at the edge. So I think in some ways that reinforced this sense of mystical power that was unjustified, those early actions. But you know, just to remind people of the history, first of all, you were among the most worried of anybody, pushing for action, much more dramatic action than what we did in the fall of '07 even. And you had the hardest job of anybody, because you had to go convince a reluctant Congress in the face of catastrophe to, at a very, let's say it wasn't a bipartisan moment in American politics, to give this huge grant of authority to a president late in his term with not many Republicans there. And the fact that you were able to do that was probably the most decisive thing that happened, because at that point, for the first time, in a crisis that was already 15 months, 14 months old, at that point we had a semblance of tools and power to start to get arms around this crisis.
Tim, talk a little bit, about the working relationship, Ben, you, and me, how we worked together. It was in many ways very extraordinary, because there were different different institutions, and you know, I get asked about that all the time.
I think even if you look at, not to be unfair to Europe, but just look at Europe the last 3 years or so, mostly it's a story about the different arms of government working against each other, fighting with each other. And that's usually the typical thing you find. You know, one person's got their foot on the brake, one's got their foot on the accelerator. They're mostly fighting about it, hope it burns itself out. That's like the typical thing, because the pressures are so great, the politics are so terrible, nobody has any idea what they're doing, and the memory of panic has receded.
Yep.
What we had was a really remarkable thing, because you had this core group of people, very different backgrounds, I think very different personalities. I mean, you know, Bernanke is he's like the Buddha of central banking. He's this, you know, pretty understated, modest, quiet force. You're pretty much the opposite of that. I mean, not in the sense that you're like relentless, powerful motion. You never sat there thinking it would take care of itself, or that we wouldn't have to make some hard choices. Yeah, and very complementary backgrounds, I think, in that context. And I think, you know, we were very lucky because we were able to suspend temporarily what is the dominant feature of, certainly of Washington, certainly most governments, where most people spend their time peacocking at each other's expense, trying to shift blame or claim credit, or avoid responsibility. And we were able to suspend that. Again, not forever, but for a brief and kind of decisive period.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary period. Tim, I want to have you talk a little bit about your relationship with President Barack Obama, because I think most people in this audience, most people in this country, are surprised when they hear that, you know, a Treasury Secretary, most of the authority the Treasury Secretary has comes from the President. What's the President? The regulators are independent, you know, so it's Treasury Secretary can do what he can persuade others to do and what the President allows him to do. So talk a little bit about how you built that relationship with the President and how important that was.
Well, you know, we didn't know each other. I first met him in New York in October of 2008, and he said I might have to ask you to come to Washington, and I told him that would be a mistake, and I tried to talk him out of it. And that was sort of useful in some sense, because I think he knew at that time that I was deeply reluctant to go back to that place, and that I wasn't going to be in it for the scene or the show. And we started out with that relationship. We had a little bit of common history together in the sense that we both lived in Southeast Asia when we were growing up, and our parents actually worked in the same field for a time, his mother and my father. But, you know, we just built this relationship in the way I think you'd like it built, by trying to work through a set of pretty terrible problems. And I tried to do what I watched you do, and I watched other people I admire do, which is to just try and meet a simple test, which is to give him my best advice, to be honest with him, to push back, to try to be true to the things I cared about the most, and try to give him good choices. And he was exceptional by any standard, in the sense that, and I write about our first meeting after he was sworn in, I was sworn in, and we're talking about the next stage of the strategy, and he said, look, your job is to come to me with a view on what we should do, put aside the politics. And he submitted those recommendations, that advice, to pretty brutal internal checks and balances, second, third pair of eyes, because it was a pretty consequential set of choices. They were going to be hugely consequential to his presidency and that fate of the country. And he did a good job of submitting those views, my suggestions, recommendations, to pretty brutal internal debate, but he was not paralyzed by that debate. He made the right decisions, at least in my view, about what we should do, and was willing to take the political heat and put the politics aside, short-term political costs aside. And I always felt exceptionally confident with him that and he made it clear this was our obligation, which is to tell him what we thought was the best policy on the merits, not that was politically easy or even feasible, but to start with that view of what was right, or what's closest to right, closest to best, and that was a great and important thing, and I admire him deeply for that.
Well, I think you touched on this next question I was going to ask, because I do think one of the reasons that the policies, the capital market stability policies, succeeded was there was great continuity from administration to administration. And I remember leaving in January of 2009 and seeing a poll where there was like 90% or some high percentage of the American people were against the TARP, and maybe 60% were against torture at the same time. So the TARP was more, and so you've got a new president coming in, and it would be very understandable to respond to the voters that elected him, respond to the base, and start over again and come up with something new. And I had a few sleepless nights when because that internal debate leaked out, and there was talk about nationalizing the banks, and the bank stocks were getting lower and lower, but you prevailed. And talk a little bit about, I think just by virtue of the fact that he chose you, showed that he was very, he is very willing to consider things that have been done in the past. But
well, let's do the history. Is for gracious. Let's do the history first, because it's a pretty remarkable period of history. And again, think back to the contrast in the transition between Hoover and Roosevelt. This was a transition between a Republican and a Democratic president at probably the most dangerous time in finance globally, economy globally, since the Great Depression. You put together a coalition that was dominated by Democrats, I think, to pass that initial authority. Then Senator Obama supported that effort.
Yep.
Worked closely with you in that cause.
Yep.
At kind of a time when you needed a bipartisan moment in that context. And then during the transition after the election, where you had to make a bunch of important decisions, we tried to find a way to let you make those decisions, make sure we were going to be supported behind you, and not second guess them, not freeze you. Because it was important you were able to keep moving. And then President Bush and Secretary Paulson went and helped then President-elect Obama still convince Congress to give us the next stage of that emergency authority before the president took office, so that we could act with alacrity once we came in. And when I first met the president that October, I said to him, you shouldn't ask me to come to Washington for lots of reasons. But one reason I said to him is that I'm up to my neck in this deeply unpopular stuff. I'm proud of the choices we made, however inadequate they were, and I'm not going to walk away from them. And you're going to have a much harder time separating yourself from them, creating some distance politically if you ask me to come work with you. So he thought through that, and he made a choice that I think was politically a more courageous choice, which is to back the necessary degree of continuity in that strategy. Now, in those early debates internally, which you said leaked out, and they were pretty damaging in that initial period of uncertainty. We did the only thing I know, and the president was excellent at this. I used to say to people, plan beats no plan. Life's about alternatives. If you don't like this plan, what's your plan? What's your idea that you think is feasible or realistic, that you think offers a better prospect of reducing more damage to the American people or getting us growing as quickly as possible? And we sat and just worked through those things. We try not to take too long doing it, although we did leave the country with more uncertainty than was desirable. But my colleagues used to say in those debates that the president could see this, that none of the alternatives presented could survive 30 minutes of debate. And the only way to test, remember, it's hard for people to appreciate this, of course, because it's hard for people to see what the choices really were, what were realistic. And most people had deeply unrealistic ideas of what was feasible. But the best way to make people comfortable with the choice was just to walk them through those things and let them try to make the case for the alternative. That's the only way I knew of doing it. And the president, I remember him asking me in the Oval Office in probably March. It was pretty terrible then. And he said to me, it's kind of awkward for me to say this, he said to me, you know, Tim, I want to know, are you confident this is going to work? And I said, well, Mr. President, you know, nothing is certain in life. And I said it took economists 60 years to come to a kind of rough consensus on what caused the Great Depression and what they screwed up in the Great Depression. But I said that I was very confident that this framework, this strategy we laid out was much better than the alternatives. Yep. And ultimately, again, however messy and however inadequate, we were able, on the strength of the actions you took and the strength of what the president was able to support in those early days, we were able to do a set of things that were remarkably effective in getting the economy growing again, recovering a large measure of the loss of savings of Americans, and preventing the type of catastrophe that has been typical across the centuries of financial panics. Again, I don't want to claim too much for it. You know, we bear the scars of the mistakes and of what we left undone and the damage still left over. But that mix of things were, by any relative measure, they were very powerful, very effective.
Yeah, what I like to say to people when there's a big, messy, ugly crisis, you're never going to find a neat, perfect, elegant solution. So Tim, I would like to talk for just a minute or two, hear you talk about Dodd-Frank, because you know, when you look at all the things you got done, they're working with Congress to get that done. And I'd like to say, so assess it. Do we have what we need in the future with Dodd-Frank?
Well, let me tell the good and the not so good. But I'll begin just a little story. Again, nothing like what you faced. But you know, this is was a deeply populist moment then. There was really not much support on the left or the right for what I think we still believe, and I think correctly believe, were the most promising reforms. And you had a really interesting, I write in the book about this, you had Republican senators, moderate Republicans, say, I want to be with you. I can't be with you, though, unless you protect these institutions in my state. We had progressive Democrats say, I need to be for tough reforms, but I can't be for tough reforms if they apply to any business in my state. And that made it kind of a hard to craft a set of reforms. Yeah. So people wanted to be for reform, but not really reform that would make any difference. And that was a challenge. So let's do the good and the not so good. Okay, the good. Most important things we did were to provide a better, it's early stage, but a much better framework of consumer protections, and to put in place a set of limits on the type of risk institutions can take, capital, leverage, liquidity, that are dramatically more conservative than it was in place before this crisis, and are applied much more broadly than before the crisis. You live with this. Remember that before the crisis, capital requirements existed for banks, not really for investment banks, not for big insurance companies, not for Fannie and Freddie, not for GE Capital, certainly not for money market funds. Those institutions and funding vehicles were, you know, more than half of credit in the American economy. So those constraints are much more conservative today. They're applied much more broadly. And there's somewhat better tools for managing the failure of large, complex institutions. We didn't have that for Bear Stearns or for Lehman or AIG. There's a slightly better framework in place for that today. Let's do the not so good. It's a messy, complicated mix of stuff. We left in place a ridiculously complicated oversight system, very balkanized, segmented. I used to describe it as Northwest Pakistan. And we left unfinished the cause of housing finance reform that you began. And Congress did take away some of the authority that was so decisive in the crisis, because you know there is this very powerful belief that in finance, fire stations cause fires, and that if you can take away the tools of the fire station, you make fires less likely. And that's not the way financial systems work. And in that populist fever of the moment, although the FDIC guarantees were not very controversial at the moment.
No.
People didn't really pay much attention to them, but in that populist moment, Congress took away that authority. So I say that's the messy, bad side of those reforms. But I think even on balance, you would say on net, they offer the prospect of giving us a pretty durable period of relative stability in finance. It won't be permanent. Because, as people lose the memory of this crisis, it'll take a while to lose the memory of this crisis. But as they lose that memory and people become more confident again, then, risk will migrate around those constraints. It's sort of inexorable, and it's a forever war. You have to be on it with a system that can adapt more dynamically than ours was able to do before the crisis.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute if we've got time, but I want to talk about career. If someone hasn't been in Washington, they won't understand really how remarkable your career was. So when you started at Treasury in 1988, you were a GS what, 11, 12?
Something like that.
Yeah, 11, 12. So he started as a...
Very important.
Yeah, career civil servant, so that's in 88. And Tim then, I used to think becoming a deputy assistant secretary for a career professional is extraordinary. Then becoming an assistant secretary, international under Bob Rubin, and then so young when he's president of the New York Fed that he gets carded when he's showing up. I met him for the first time. I thought he was 19 or 20. I thought, Bob Rubin said, "You've got to meet this guy." I had him come over, and I'm trying to think, was this his assistant that arrived first? And so doing all that, and then finishing up as Secretary of the Treasury. Now maybe the reason I like the way you wrote your books so well is because I don't have a lot of patience for all the career engineers that come out of their mother's womb. I'm going to be a CEO, or I'm going to go into private equity, and boy, I'm going to plan out every step along the way. But I would like you to there are a lot of people in this audience, I'm sure, that have got maybe young people or have got students that are graduating, and I really believe every young person who cares about a career, there's lessons to be. You deal with great humility, but the way you describe your career, I think, is terrific and laid out. So I'd like to. So what is your career advice when people come to you and ask you for advice? You show it by demonstration in your book, but what do you say to people when they come to you?
You're so gracious. I remember when early on when I met Larry Summers for the first time, he said to me after a while, he said, "You're pretty good. I can imagine you, maybe at some point running some firm or something. I just don't know how you get hired. No credentials." So I had this. I didn't really know what I wanted to do in my life. I lived overseas growing up. I decided I want to work for my country. Thought that'd be compelling. And then I had this amazing experience, really from the beginning. I was 28 when I started, of finding this great richness and reward in trying to be part of shaping the policy choices the country was making. At that stage, it was on the international side of the Treasury. It's sort of ironic in this country, as you found, in some ways, on the international part of the Treasury and finance, there's more authority to do things to affect the course of
an understatement.
Yeah, exactly. than is true on the rest of the portfolio. You could do in some ways more about Mexico or Thailand or Korea than you could about the failure of the American financial system. So I had this, because the world was a pretty dangerous place at that time, I had this experience of helping to be part of trying to mitigate the damage from a series of financial crises around across the emerging markets. And I just had this experience of working with people who I thought were just deeply ethical people, really very smart people, overwhelmingly motivated by what was the right thing to do. There wasn't much of the crass politics. Politics is a pejorative that interfered with those choices in that context. And it was a really rewarding thing, but I had no plan. It's just that, and I always thought I'd just do it for 3 years or so.
But your plan, Tim, was to do the incredibly good job, the very best job, every step of the way without saying, well, is this going to lead to someplace else? And you did such a great job. It took care of itself because there always were people you had the good fortune to work with and for people that recognized your ability and made sure that the next step took care of itself.
Yeah, I tried to focus on just doing the best I could, not worrying about what came next, and just trying to make sure I was working with people I trusted, doing something I believed in. I thought that was the only thing I could control, and I thought I'd focus on that. And I was really lucky in that context. Worked with really great people I admired, and had the great fortune of having it was a pretty dangerous time, so you learn more in that context. Lucky, and I don't. I watch my kids growing up now, and I have one child who is pretty sure she knows what she wants to do. I look at that with some envy because I never had that conviction. And I have another who is definitely ahead of where I was at that time, but doesn't have that conviction. So I always sort of looked at it with envy when I see that early conviction in people, what they wanted to do. I didn't have that, but I feel so lucky.
You can have. So I think it's great when they've got the conviction, but when they then say, I'm going to do this and then do this and do that, it's always a bit.
Life doesn't work out that way.
It sure doesn't. It's going to disappoint you. So
Also, I try to be an inspiring model to people because people look at me and they say, I don't know, he seems like a normal person, not that capable. Maybe I could do that. It's really inspiring.
Yeah. You know what I say to that? Bullshit. You are. So this is from the time I first met Tim, I could tell it didn't take more than a couple of meetings to realize how really special he was. So Tim, I got just a couple more questions before we're going to go to the audience. And the second to the last one is, how do you think your career prepared you for the financial crisis? And I'm not asking the technical question, okay? Because sure, you were there, you went through the Asian financial crisis. I mean, Mervyn King made the joke when you and I were at his. Mervyn King was, the head of the Bank of England, and he said that he had a great line that Tim, wherever there was a crisis, Tim was there when you looked at all the early financial crises, and he was living proof that being there wasn't the cause of the crisis.
Yeah, he said I didn't cause the crises. That was nice of him. He said the crisis caused me.
That's right.
It was nice.
And that was the crisis, because you is a very, very apt line. But what is it that helped you deal with the pressure, and how did your career prepare you for this?
I don't think anything prepared any of us for this. I think what I learned was that the world's full of gray. There's no certainty in these decisions. There are no obvious choices, and you have to look at your options with the knowledge that there's going to be no perfect, easy, risk-free solution, and you have to look at the costs of all alternatives, and you have to look at what happens when you make a mistake, because you'll make mistakes. And in some sense, you have to be guided by a judgment of, which mistakes are easier to correct for. Is the costly mistake doing too little or doing too much? And I got to watch and be part of making those decisions in a bunch of complicated problems, and that was very helpful. And I found that these just seem like basic lessons, easy to aspire to, hard to produce, but as long as you surround yourself with people who were talented, that you trusted, that had some diversity of perspectives, and were willing to push back at you and tell you when you were full of it, and willing to debate openly the choices, willing to have a competition of ideas, willing just to sit there relentlessly and work through those choices, that that was the best chance you're going to come to better decisions. And I got a lot of good early exposure to how to do that well, and always try to create that sense of culture around decisions in the places where I had some ability to choose the people around me. And I don't know any other way to do it. And I do think, as you said, I think that's more important than the technical knowledge.
and being willing when we made our mistakes, we weren't afraid to reverse them, and right there on the battlefield, because
you just gotta keep at it, and you have to recognize that and just you meet constraint and you say, okay, how do I go around that constraint? And you go, okay, that didn't have that much traction. What's the next stage of escalation? And just going through that process is such an important thing to do. I mean, I think, again, it's hard for people to appreciate this because the economy is still a pretty tough economy, and we're still living with all the scars of the damage. And it was a very messy, terribly damaging crisis, even with all the tremendous stuff we threw at it. But the most successful examples of crisis management are a record of constant innovation, evolution, and strategy. There's not this sort of neat thing where you wake up one day and these people flip a switch with one decision and it's all over. They just don't work that way. It requires that ability to just to try to work through the messy choices.
So I'm going to ask you a last question before we get Mike out here in Moscow and take questions from the audience. But you had a lot of terrific lines in the book. And I'd like to end on a more optimistic note. I'll let the audience ask you about what's the likelihood of the next financial crisis and do we have the tools and all that. But you said something that was great, and it really captured a lot of what I felt too, because you said, when I was in Washington and friends would ask me, what's it like? I would say, worse than you think. And he said, okay, and you said, now, after I've been out for a year, and people ask me, what was it like? And I say, better than you think. Okay, what did you explain what you meant by that?
I guess I mean two things, which is if you look back and you compare what this country was able to do at that moment of grave peril, relative to not just the choices we made in the Great Depression, but the choices governments have made since in the decades that followed, even this pretty damaged, weakened political system we have was able to do the essential thing. It wasn't enough, wasn't adequate, but it met the essential test of preventing a panic from leading to mass unemployment. And even in the wake of the terrible politics that followed, I think if you look at what's happening across this country today, they're imperfect and they're messy and they're incomplete, but there are very promising, important things happening to how we use healthcare, how we educate our people, how we use energy, that, again, even if they're messy, inadequate, and imperfect, we are, I think, relative to what you see many countries around the world capable of doing, we're capable of pretty enormous things. And I think that, again, if you listen closely, which I try not to do to Washington these days, I think some of the worst fever is breaking. I mean, just to take a pretty pathetic example, the Republicans seem to be, not to put it on them, but seem to be diffusing the debt limit as an appealing choice of political leverage because it's so catastrophic, damaging politically. Pretty dangerous flirtation with that, but seem to have recognized it's pretty damaging to them. Even that fever is cooled a little bit. So, we just got to figure out as a country how to rediscover that capacity for pragmatic accommodation on things that make a difference in people's lives, and we'll rediscover it again. It just seems kind of remote to us today.
Yeah, well, good. So good. With that, on that optimistic note, let's have Michael come on up. All right.
Now, Tim, Hank, that was a great discussion, and I just want to say on behalf of everyone here, we are privileged to be here with two great public servants, and you deserve a lot of credit for what you've done for our country. So we have a lot of questions that have come in here, as you would expect. One of them, or a series of them, relate to what we were just talking about before. You said we made mistakes. So a lot of people have asked, what would you do differently? You said you made mistakes. What would you do differently now? This is for both of you.
Well, I'll do my view on it. The two most consequential things that had the biggest impact on how bad the crisis was and how slow the recovery was were the following. We went into this crisis with very weak tools to prevent a major panic. It took us as a country too long to get that authority. Remember, Congress didn't want to give it to Hank, voted it down initially. It took terror to produce that. And that inability to escalate quickly enough ultimately produced a financial shock that was 5 times greater than what happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. Just gravely perilous. It's important to recognize that because a lot of people think that what happened was the mistakes people made was they just did too much. The fire station was too active. It's not really true. What happened was, as a country, we didn't have the tools to act aggressively enough, in a preemptive way as the thing escalated. Very damaging. Quickly, the second thing was we lost the ability to sustain an adequate level of public investments, tax stimulus for the economy too early, because the country got caught up in a little bit of an austerity fever, and those deficits, which were so daunting and troubling to many people, produced a pretty strong movement to bring them down really quickly. That was going to have to happen, but it happened in a pretty badly designed way very quickly, and it sucked a lot of wind out of an economy at early stage in recovery. And I used to say, important lesson of history in financial crises is, you need to act with overwhelming force. You need to take more risk, not less. You can't let the thing get away from you, get too much momentum, because it's very hard to arrest. And then you got to prepare for a long war, because the damage caused by crises is so difficult and the healing process so protracted. You have to be willing to keep at it for a long time. And typically what countries do is they put on the brakes. They declare victory too quickly. There's no declarations of victory here, but there was a premature embrace of the brake, the fiscal brake, at a time when they should have kept the foot off the brake. Those were the most damaging, consequential things. But I try to write very candidly, openly about a range of other things that I missed, or I was part of, that definitely added to that damage.
Yeah. So I agree with what Tim said. I would just add 2 things. The first thing I would say is I think the reason that I'm not going to point to even more mistakes is that when we made mistakes, when I was there, and when I made mistakes, we were then willing to reverse ourselves. First with Fannie and Freddie, which was, I think, a very consequential thing, I didn't believe we were going to need to invoke the emergency powers, and I took the bazooka out. We took the bazooka out, and then secondly, with saying we weren't going to put capital in the banks and we were going to buy illiquid assets, and we reversed ourselves on that. So I think those were, it's important to do that. And then I focus on, I think Tim hit the big things. I focus on a whole lot of things I just wish I'd been able to do better. And the biggest one was never, ever able to convince the American people what we were doing was for them and not for the banks. It was just and those that have, I think I'm a lot better one-on-one than I am. Those of you who have heard me read a speech, it's not a pleasant thing, and I don't think I ever, I was never able to. I'll tell you, it's a hard sale to make, though, to try to in the United States of America, to try to defend a bailout. But it's an ugly thing to defend, but it's necessary.
Well, Tim, you said in the book that, just building on this, that you clearly helped the banks, which had to be done. On the other hand, you said you wished you could have done more for housing. You want to elaborate on that?
Again, just to start with the basic paradox of financial panics is that there's no way to protect people from the risk of massive further carnage in lost jobs, income, houses, businesses. if you let the financial system collapse. And though it looks like, inevitably, unavoidably, it looks like you're acting to protect the arsonist, we're pretty indifferent to the arsonist. We just knew that if you let the lights go out in the system, that it would be mass unemployment. So that was the basic burden we all carried, is that every judgment, every action we thought was essential to protect the average innocent had this appearance of look like we were rewarding the undeserving. Housing was terrible. Housing was terrible because we had a massive recession and millions of people lost their jobs or saw their incomes cut in half, who had borrowed what they thought was a prudent amount of money against the value of their house. And the scale of that pressure on housing was vastly disproportionate to the resources and authority we had to fix it. We kept trying to operate at the frontier of our authority, use the resources we had, and we did ultimately help millions of people stay in their homes and refinance their mortgages and put a floor on house prices and begin the healing process. But those actions were deeply inadequate relative to the size of the problem. But it wasn't because we didn't understand how terrible housing was. Remember, this was a Democratic president elected with sort of a pretty substantial political capital at the beginning, surrounded by some of the best housing talent in the country, a lot of progressive economists, a lot of people with deep understanding of financial crises, had all the right incentives. He put relentless pressure on us. You know, he used to take home 10 letters a night, most of whom were people who were in the risk of losing their homes. They made you cry, these letters. And he would bring us into the White House over and over again saying, okay, what's next? Why can't we do this? He put a relentless pressure on us. But the tools we had were weak and deeply inadequate against the scale of the problem. So of course I wish we could have done more, and I wish we could have relaxed those constraints, but we were unable to relax those constraints.
I would say there was nothing during the time I was there that I spent more time on and worked harder on than the housing. And it was a very difficult political problem and a very difficult economic problem. I would add that I think the most impactful thing that was done on housing was, putting Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. Could you imagine what would have happened then? And so I think that's the action that probably gets the least attention and was the most impactful. But the other thing I just would simply say, when you're trying to keep people in their homes, it's very hard to do it if they can't afford to stay in a home. It's really hard without a massive amount of money. And it's very hard to try to keep someone in the home politically if they can afford but want to walk away from the mortgage. So it's a difficult thing which we both worked very hard on.
We have a lot of questions about Lehman, which I think is understandable given the severity of the impact on the economy back in the fall of '08. And you've said here tonight that, and Ben Bernanke has said the same thing, you did not have the legal authority to do any more than you did. But Tim, in your book, you say that this is one of the few times there was some distance between you and Hank, and even you and Ben Bernanke. And you said you would have had supported having the Fed assume some risk.
And Ben and Hank would have too, and I say that too. What I described is that in that moment, I mean, it's a pretty remarkable thing. Let's go back. On even Monday, after the failure of Lehman, the New York Times editorial page and the Wall Street Journal editorial page, rarely in agreement, were thrilled. They thought it was terrific, excellent outcome for the country. And if you look at the mood of the nation in the days before that, there was huge pressure. And the dominant conventional view in the political system, and I think much of the country was, that's it for bailouts, no more bailouts. And I write about how, and I think this is fair, Hank, I think I write about how if you listen to our conversation on the phone, you could hear in Washington, in the political people around Hank and Ben, you could hear them trying to pull us all back from doing any more escalation of the rescue at that time because it was so deeply unpopular. But I am completely confident that if we had a willing buyer for Lehman that weekend, and we worked very hard. Hank worked extremely hard to find that, to try and find one. If we had a willing buyer, but we had to do what we did in Bear Stearns to make it work, which is have the Fed assume the legally permissible amount of risk, I'm very confident that we would have done that, and that would have probably been the right thing to do. We still would have had a pretty terrible financial crisis, even if we'd done that.
But I'd make just an additional comment, because we worked, for months before Lehman went down. Right after Bear Stearns went down, Ben and I went and talked to Barney Frank about it. So we did everything we could think of so we were quite unified. I mean, obviously the political people around us, but I never listened to the political people. And the president, George Bush was absolutely terrific in terms of the way he backed us. So, but we were unable to get a buyer. And I'll tell you, the interesting thing is, I look back on it now, as unhappy as we all were when there wasn't a buyer, turns out there was really only one real buyer. And I believe that if B of A had bought Lehman, then Merrill was going to go down right afterwards, and that would have been even a worse situation. So the key thing was we just plain didn't have a buyer.
So what was the distance between you then?
Oh, no, I don't, as I said, I feel like, and again, look at what happened in the wake of that. I felt that, and I always was very confident that they were, and Hank had already taken an enormously courageous political risk already, if you just look at Fannie and Freddie, not just the stuff we'd done earlier. So I was very confident they were going to be willing to do what was necessary. It's just that, we had kind of weak, pathetic tools at that point until Hank was successful in getting Congress to authorize TARP.
And you debate tactics. So we wanted to set up a situation, which was, and Tim talks about it a little bit in his book, very much like something he was involved in earlier from the government side, and which was something that the New York Fed had done when a hedge fund was going down. We were trying to get the private sector to come in to make it easier to do a deal. And I had felt that if I just announced, guess what, Uncle Ben and Uncle Hank are going to be here with a checkbook, that we wouldn't have been able to do that. So we set it up tactically, and we came pretty darn close. But as we've looked back on it, we wonder if we'd succeeded in doing what we were wanting to do, whether it would have actually, it might have been worse if say, a Merrill had gone down.
Yeah, I mean, again, people, it's appropriate for people to look at Lehman as being this defining moment, but that Friday night when we were at the New York Fed together around the table,